All right, folks, get ready, because today we are diving deep into some seriously dense philosophical territory. I mean, we're talking Paul Natorp here.
Oh yeah, Natorp. You're not kidding about dense.
Not kidding at all. Prominent figure in the Marburg school of Neo-Kantianism.
Right.
A big name at Marburg University around the turn of the 20th century. And his ideas are, well, let's just say they take some serious unpacking.
Definitely not light reading, that's for sure.
No. But that's kind of why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To break down these complex philosophical concepts and try to, make them a little less intimidating, maybe a little more accessible.
Exactly. Shine some light on them.
Exactly. And trust me, this deep dive, it's worth the effort. We're talking about a thinker who influenced a seriously diverse group of people. Boris Pasternak,
Oh, wow.
Karl Barth,
Oh,
even, get this, T.S. Eliot.
no way. Really?
Yes. Pretty wide range, wouldn't you say?
That's incredible. Yeah, it really speaks to the breadth of Natorp's influence and how deep it goes, too.
For sure. And so today we're going to zero in on three key areas of his thought, where his ideas, I think, really shine through. His philosophy of science, his unique approach to the history of philosophy, and then his really interesting concept of critical psychology.
Great areas to focus on. Yeah.
That's pretty good, right? Like a real philosophical feast.
Now does this.
But before we get too deep into those areas, I think it's helpful to set the stage a bit. Neo-Kantianism, that was a whole movement in itself.
Oh, absolutely.
In the Marburg school, they had their own particular flavor, you could say. Can you give us a little taste of that context?
Well, you can think about it this way. By the late 19th century, there was a sense that philosophy had become, well, maybe a little too speculative. Like it had lost touch with the rigor and the grounding that Kant brought to the table. And so Neo-Kantianism, it emerged as this attempt to, revive Kant's legacy and address some of those challenges that came with modern science and culture.
So it's like back to the basics, but with a modern spin on it.
Yeah, exactly. And the Marburg School, led by Hermann Cohen, and of course with Natorp as a key player, they took a pretty interesting approach. They really focused on what's called the transcendental method.
Okay, so tell us a little about this. What is the transcendental method?
It's all about figuring out the necessary conditions for something to even be possible. So it's less about what we actually experience and more about how experience itself is even possible in the first place.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this gets pretty meta pretty quickly.
It can.
Can you give us maybe a more concrete example of how this transcendental method actually works?
Sure, yeah. Let's take something as seemingly simple as just looking at a star in the night sky. So we see this point of light.
Right.
We feel this sense of wonder, maybe. But behind that experience, there are these incredibly complex astronomical equations that describe the star's motion, its properties. And so the transcendental method asks, what makes it possible for us to have both that subjective experience, that feeling of seeing a star, and also the objective knowledge, the astronomy,
Okay. So it's about bridging that gap between, on the one hand, our immediate perceptions, and then on the other hand, the scientific frameworks that we use to understand the world.
Exactly. And that's where Natorp's philosophy of science really takes off. He argues that to really understand science, we can't just focus on the results, the facts that it uncovers. We really have to grasp the method, that process by which scientific knowledge is generated.
So it's not just about what we know, but how we come to know it.
Exactly.
And that brings us to this intriguing idea from Natorp that science is, as he puts it, a fieri.
Fieri.
Yeah, it's a Latin term, basically meaning a constant process of becoming. So it's not a factum.
Right, not static.
Yeah, not a static, fixed body of knowledge. It's more about this dynamic unfolding of knowledge, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's a really crucial distinction. He's arguing that science isn't just about accumulating, a set of truths. It's this ongoing activity, this process of constructing and testing hypotheses, refining our understanding through this constant back and forth between theory and observation.
So for him, really grasping the method of science is key. And he had some really interesting ideas about the role of hypotheses in that whole process, right?
Absolutely. Natorp took the term hypothesis very seriously, like going all the way back to its Greek roots. He saw it as this setting down or a laying under.
Okay.
It's a foundation upon which we build our understanding. And he really believed that forming hypotheses is an active, creative process.
So it's not just passively observing the world.
Right, exactly.
It's actively shaping our understanding of it through these conceptual frameworks.
So in a way, he's saying we're not just like
mirrors reflecting the world, but we're active participants in actually constructing our knowledge.
Mhm.
It's almost like we're solving for X, trying to figure out the underlying structure of reality through this process of forming hypotheses and testing them.
That's a great way to put it. And for Natorp, this whole process is driven by a striving for what he calls complete determination. So science, in his view, is constantly aiming to fully grasp the objects of its study, to articulate their essence, their being, through a system of concepts and laws.
But if science is always striving, always reaching for this like complete determination, does that mean that knowledge is always sort of provisional? Like we're never really done, are we?
That is a key insight. Yeah, for Natorp, scientific knowledge is always open to revision. It's not about finding some ultimate unchanging truth, but about constantly refining and expanding our understanding.
Okay. And that leads us, I think, to another really crucial aspect of Natorp's thought, which is his concept of thinking itself. Now, I know he uses the term function to describe thinking, but it's not quite what we might typically think of when we hear that word, right?
Absolutely not. For Natorp, function isn't about subjective mental processes, like things happening inside our heads. He's talking about the very activity of thinking, that spontaneous, synthetic act of bringing order to what would otherwise just be the chaos of experience. So it's about how thinking actively shapes and structures the world that we perceive.
So thinking for Natorp isn't like passive perception, it's active construction.
Yes.
It's about imposing order, not just discovering order that's already out there.
Precisely.
Okay, and this is where his concept of categories comes in, right?
Yep.
Natorp believed that all concepts, all the ways we think about the world, are essentially functional. They act as categories, shaping our understanding and organizing our experience.
Yes.
Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky for me, I think, because, Kant made this very clear distinction between concepts and intuitions. How does Natorp deal with that?
That's a great question. Natorp doesn't see that distinction as so rigid.
Oh, okay.
He actually views intuition itself as a form of synthesis, a way of bringing unity to all the different things we experience.
Okay.
So even our most basic experiences are already being shaped by thinking, by these underlying categories.
So even what seems like just pure, unfiltered perception is already structured by thought in some way.
That's the idea.
There's no escaping the conceptual framework.
Right. Now, to be clear, Natorp does distinguish between two levels of what he calls phenomena or appearances. He calls the first level the phenomenon of last instance. That's the raw data of our senses before thinking has fully organized it.
Okay, so that's like the pure, unfiltered experience, the stuff that's maybe too chaotic and subjective for us to really grasp directly.
Exactly. And then he talks about second-order phenomena, which are the objects that have been shaped and structured by thinking, by applying categories to them. These are the objects that we can actually study and understand scientifically.
So I'm starting to see how this all ties together now. Thinking, for Natorp, is all about this process of objectification.
Yes.
It's about moving from that raw, subjective experience to a more structured, conceptually grounded understanding of the world.
Exactly. And that's why he uses the analogy of solving for X. We start with a problem, something unknown, and then we use our conceptual tools, our hypotheses and calculations, to gradually determine its value, to reveal its essence.
So the objects of scientific knowledge, those second-order phenomena, they're like the X in the equation.
Right.
We don't just stumble upon them. We actively construct our understanding of them through this process of conceptual determination.
That's a great way to put it. It highlights the dynamic interplay between thinking and experience in Natorp's philosophy of science.
This has been quite the deep dive already. But I do have one more question before we move on.
Okay.
If we can't really know those first-order phenomena, that raw data of our senses, then how do we even get started in this process of objectification? Where does that first hypothesis come from?
That's the million-dollar question. And it gets right to the heart of Natorp's concept of the transcendental. He argues that there must be some fundamental law, a principle that makes lawfulness itself possible.
Like a law that governs all other laws.
Exactly. He called it the law of lawfulness. And he saw it as the very foundation of reason itself. It's the principle that says all experience must be grounded in law, in rationality.
So it's like this, almost like an a priori principle that we bring to experience.
Yeah.
Something that makes experience itself possible.
Precisely. And for Natorp, this principle is the ultimate source of reason's autonomy. It's not something we derive from experience, but something we impose on experience.
Okay.
It's the ground that allows us to even make sense of the world in a rational, lawful way.
Okay, now that is mind-blowing. We've gone from looking at a star to the very foundation of reason itself. I think our listeners need a moment to digest all of this.
I think they do, but we've only just scratched the surface. Next, we'll delve into how this whole framework plays out in Natorp's very unique approaches to psychology and the history of philosophy.
Okay, so we're back and ready to go even deeper into this world of Paul Natorp. Before the break, we took a bit of a tangent there, I think, exploring the foundations of reason and scientific knowledge. But I'm really curious to see how this all applies to Natorp's view of psychology. It calls it critical psychology, which just sounds intriguing.
It is intriguing and maybe a little unexpected for some people. Natorp's approach to psychology is fundamentally different from what we might think of as mainstream psychology even today. He's not interested in just cataloging different mental states or studying individual consciousness in the way that, say, William James might have been interested in.
So what's so critical about his psychology? What's he pushing back against?
Well, it goes back to those two levels of phenomena that we were talking about earlier, that raw subjective experience of the phenomenon of last instance, and then the more objective, conceptually structured second-order phenomena. Natorp argues that a direct psychology of that raw subjective experience, that first level, it's just impossible.
Wait, really? Why would he say that? Isn't the whole point of psychology to try to understand our inner lives, our subjective experiences?
That's certainly a very common view, but Natorp takes a really radical stance here. Remember, for him, thinking is all about objectification. It's about shaping and structuring experience using these categories. Trying to study that subjective experience directly, he says, is like trying to grasp smoke. It's constantly shifting, it's elusive, it just resists the very act of us trying to conceptualize it.
So it's kind of like trying to study a dream while you're still in it.
Exactly. We just can't step outside of our own subjectivity to analyze it in this purely objective way. Natorp argues that any attempt to do that is going to inevitably end up imposing some kind of conceptual framework onto something that inherently resists that kind of structuring.
Okay, I can see that. So if we can't directly access that subjective experience, then what does Natorp propose we do instead? How can we even study the mind if we can't look at it directly?
Well, he suggests this really fascinating alternative. We study the mind indirectly by looking at its products, the objects that have already been objectified by thinking. So it's a bit like reverse engineering some complex machine. We can't directly observe those internal workings, but by studying the outputs, the functions, we can start to infer something about the underlying mechanisms.
So instead of trying to peer directly into this black box of consciousness, he's saying we should look at what comes out of it. So we study the structures of knowledge, the systems of thought that the mind produces, and that can give us some clues about the mind itself.
You got it. He calls this whole process methodical regression. So we start with those second-order phenomena, the objects of scientific knowledge, and then we carefully trace them back to their origins, to those earlier, more subjective stages of understanding. It's about uncovering the process by which thinking gradually shapes and objectifies experience.
This is making me think of like archaeology. We dig through these layers of history and we uncover artifacts and remnants of the past to try to reconstruct a picture of how people lived, thought, and interacted with the world. Is that kind of a fair comparison?
Absolutely. Just as archaeologists reconstruct the past by carefully excavating and analyzing those material remains, Natorp believes that we can uncover the workings of the mind by carefully examining the products of thought, those conceptual structures that shape our understanding.
This is a really fascinating approach. It's like he's saying we can learn about the mind by studying the history of ideas, the evolution of scientific concepts. It's a much more historical and I would say philosophical approach to psychology than we typically see.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it really highlights this key theme that runs throughout Natorp's work, the interconnectedness of thought and history. He sees the history of philosophy, in particular, as this reflection of the ongoing evolution of reason, the unfolding of its potential through time.
And that leads us nicely into Natorp's take on the history of philosophy then. He's not just chronicling these ideas from the great thinkers of the past, he's really looking for something deeper, isn't he?
For sure. Remember, for Natorp, philosophy is fundamentally a philosophy of science. He's interested in that history of science as a way to understand the very nature of thinking itself. And he sees the evolution of scientific thought as a series of moments where reason becomes self-conscious, where it's reflecting on its own methods and its own foundations.
So he's looking for those turning points in history where thinkers kind of take a step back and they ask, how do we know what we know? What are the principles that guide our pursuit of knowledge?
That's it, exactly. And the Marburg School as a whole, they saw this self-reflective process as being absolutely crucial to the advancement of science. They called this approach the history of scientific idealism, emphasizing the role of reason in shaping our understanding of the world.
Okay, so how does this differ from, say, other views of history? I mean, Hegel, for example, he had his whole idea of the unfolding of Geist, this kind of progressive march towards absolute knowledge.
That's a great point. Hegel's view of history was linear, teleological, always striving towards this final destination. The Marburg School, on the other hand, they had a more cyclical view of history. They saw science as constantly circling around this core idea of method, of rational inquiry. It's not about reaching some final destination, but about this ongoing process of reflection and renewal.
So it's like a spiral, each cycle building upon the previous one, but always kind of returning to these fundamental questions about method and the foundations of knowledge. There's a sense of both progress and this continuity.
Yes, and they believed that by studying the history of science, we can trace those moments when reason kind of recollects its own foundations, when it rediscovers its own principles in a new light.
It's almost like those moments of recollection are these mini renaissances, these periods of renewed vigor and insight in the history of thought.
That's a great analogy. And this is where things get really, really interesting. The Marburg School, and Natorp in particular, they saw Plato as a pivotal figure in this whole historical narrative.
Plato, really. I mean, he's not exactly known for his contributions to empirical science, is he?
Well, that's the common view, but the Marburgers had a very different take on Plato. They saw him as the ultimate source of this scientific idealism, someone who was grappling with those fundamental questions about the relationship between thinking and experience, about the nature of objectivity and knowledge, centuries before modern science emerged.
I see. So their whole approach to the history of philosophy is really about challenging those traditional narratives, those neat categories that we often impose on thinkers and movements.
Exactly. And Natorp in particular was deeply invested in this project of reinterpreting Plato. He even wrote this massive, and I mean massive, book on Plato titled Plato's Idean Lair, which is all about reinterpreting Plato's philosophy through this very specific lens of scientific idealism.
Plato's Idean Lair. Wow, that sounds like quite the tome. But I can see how it fits into this bigger picture that we've been talking about. Natorp is trying to show that Plato, far from being some kind of mystical dreamer, was actually laying the groundwork for this rational, methodologically rigorous understanding of the world.
Precisely. And this is where his interpretation of Plato's theory forms gets really interesting. He argues that Plato's forms aren't these transcendent, otherworldly entities, but they're more like categorical hypotheses, similar to those hypotheses that we were discussing earlier in relation to Natorp's own philosophy of science.
Hold on, so he's saying that those eternal, unchanging forms that Plato talked about are actually like conceptual tools, structures of thinking that we use to make sense of the world. That's a pretty radical reinterpretation.
It is. But it makes perfect sense within Natorp's framework. He's arguing that Plato, in his own way, was grappling with those same fundamental questions about the role of thinking in shaping how we understand reality. He's saying that those forms, those seemingly abstract and ethereal entities, they're actually the fundamental concepts that structure our thinking and make knowledge possible.
So instead of seeing Plato as some kind of mystic who is detached from the world of science, they saw him as almost a proto-scientist, someone who was laying the groundwork for a rational understanding of the world.
That's a great way to put it. Now, of course, their interpretation of Plato is controversial. Not everyone agrees with this reading, but it's a testament to their commitment to this idea of scientific idealism, to this project of tracing the development of reason throughout history.
Wow, this is all so much more nuanced and interconnected than I ever imagined. I'm starting to see how Natorp is weaving together these seemingly disparate threads, Kant, Plato, modern science, into this complex and fascinating tapestry.
And we're just getting started. Next, we'll explore some of the broader implications of Natorp's thought and consider those enduring questions he raises for us today.
Wow, we've been on quite a philosophical journey with Paul Natorp, haven't we? It's amazing to me how his ideas, even though they're from over a century ago, still feel so relevant today.
I totally agree. His work really raises these fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, science, even the human mind, and I think we're still grappling with them in the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that really struck me is Natorp's insistence that philosophy should be grounded in those facts of culture, particularly the facts of science. He doesn't seem interested in, like, abstract speculation that's totally detached from the real world.
No, definitely not. For Natorp, philosophy has to engage with those concrete achievements of human reason, with the domains where we've really expanded our knowledge and understanding, and he sees science as the prime example of that.
Right. But what I think is so fascinating is that he doesn't limit this focus to just the natural sciences. He applies that same critical lens to the history of philosophy itself, seeing it as a reflection of the ongoing evolution of reason. It's like he's saying that by studying how philosophical ideas have developed over time, we can gain these insights into the very nature of thinking.
That's right. And for Natorp, those moments in history where philosophers explicitly grappled with the methods and foundations of knowledge, those, what we called earlier, those moments of recollection, those are the crucial turning points in this narrative. They're the moments where reason takes a step back and reflects on its own operations, and that's what leads to new insights and advancements in our understanding.
It makes me think about how even, our most cherished scientific theories, they're constantly being challenged and refined. It's a good reminder that knowledge isn't static. It's this dynamic process, always in motion.
For sure. And that's why I think Natorp's emphasis on method is so important. If scientific knowledge is always evolving, always open to revision, then what is it that provides that sense of stability and continuity? It's the method, that rigorous process of inquiry and hypothesis testing that gives science its grounding and makes sure that it continues to progress.
So it's not just about the results, the specific facts that we uncover, but it's really about the underlying process, that logic of scientific inquiry that allows us to generate, reliable and meaningful knowledge.
Exactly. And that's why Natorp sees the philosophy of science as being so essential. It's about understanding the principles that guide our pursuit of knowledge, that whole framework within which scientific inquiry operates.
Sounds like philosophy provides the scaffolding,
Yeah.
for this huge edifice of scientific knowledge.
Right.
So it ensures that the structure is sound, even as the specific content within it is being, constantly updated and revised.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings us back to that crucial concept that we discussed earlier, theory. Science, for Natorp, is this ongoing process of becoming, this constant striving for a more complete and comprehensive understanding of the world.
It's a good reminder that even when we make those big scientific breakthroughs, there's always more to discover, more questions to ask, more mysteries to unravel. It's really about embracing that ongoing adventure of intellectual inquiry.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that that adventure isn't just about accumulating more and more facts. It's about deepening our understanding of those underlying principles that govern the universe, about refining our methods of inquiry, and about constantly pushing the boundaries of what we know and how we know it.
It's about seeing science as this journey, not just a destination. And it's a journey that requires both rigorous, empirical investigation and careful philosophical reflection.
Exactly. And that's why Natorp's work is just so valuable even today. He reminds us that philosophy and science aren't these separate disciplines. They're really intertwined partners in this grand pursuit of knowledge.
It's been such an insightful deep dive. I think we've only scratched the surface of Natorp's philosophy, which is, complex and challenging. But as we wrap things up, what would you say are, some key takeaways for our listeners? What are some enduring questions his work raises for us today?
Well, I think one really crucial takeaway is that idea of fieri, that recognition that knowledge is this dynamic process, that it's always evolving, always open to revision. It's a reminder that we should even approach those scientific beliefs that we hold most dear with a healthy dose of skepticism, with a willingness to question our assumptions and to explore new possibilities.
Yeah, it's about cultivating that intellectual humility, recognizing that even the most brilliant minds are products of their time, and that our understanding of the world is constantly being, refined and expanded.
Absolutely. Another key takeaway, I think, is Natorp's emphasis on method. He reminds us that science isn't just about accumulating facts. It's about engaging in that rigorous process of inquiry, testing our hypotheses, critical analysis. It's about understanding the logic behind scientific discovery, the principles that allow us to actually distinguish between reliable knowledge and just mere speculation.
It's about recognizing that science has that rationality, that method that guides our search for truth, and that method is constantly being refined and improved as we face new challenges and expand our understanding of the world.
And finally, I think Natorp's work challenges us to think more deeply about that relationship between philosophy and the history of ideas. He really encourages us to see the history of philosophy not as just this collection of past theories, but as a reflection of how reason has been evolving, how its potential has been unfolding over time.
It's about recognizing that the great thinkers of the past, they were grappling with a lot of the same fundamental questions that we're facing today, and that their insights can still help us in our own quest for understanding. It's about seeing that history of thought as this living conversation, a dialogue that we're all participating in as we continue to, explore the mysteries of the universe and the human mind.
So, as we conclude our exploration of Paul Natorp's philosophy, let's leave our listeners with a final thought, a question to ponder as they continue on their own philosophical journeys. Given Natorp's emphasis on the history of science and those moments where reason becomes self-conscious of its methodical foundations, where might we find similar moments of recollection or rebirth of scientific idealism in our current understanding of the world?
It's a great question to leave our listeners with. It's an invitation to really think about that current state of science, philosophy, and culture, and consider how we might be playing a part in this ongoing process of reason self-discovery.
It's a reminder that the deep dive never really ends, right? There's always more to explore, more to understand, more to question, and that's the beauty of it all.
So until next time, fellow philosophy enthusiasts, keep diving deep and keep those minds engaged.